The phenomenon of apocalypticism takes its name from the literary genre apocalypse, and ultimately from the Apocalypse of John, the last book of the New Testament, usually dated towards the end of the 1st century. This is not to say that the canonical apocalypse should be considered normative for the genre, but it is simply a historical fact. This is the way the genre came to be identified. What we call apocalyptic literature is literature that resembles the book of Revelation in varying degrees. Revelation itself stood in a literary tradition that had developed in Judaism in the centuries before the turn of the era. The most obvious precedent is found in the visions of the book of Daniel, which dates from the Maccabean era, about 164 BCE. A few other apocalypses in the Danielic tradition attributed to Ezra and Baruch are roughly contemporary with Revelation. A different but related strand of apocalyptic tradition is found in books attributed to Enoch, a patriarch who supposedly lived before the flood, but only started to publish in the Hellenistic period. The writings that we call apocalyptic literature represented a new phenomenon in Judaism in the Hellenistic period. They were revelations, and as such might reasonably be regarded as a development of biblical prophecy. All these books are in fact classified as prophecy in Christian tradition. They differed, however, from the prophecies of Isaiah or Jeremiah in significant respects. The older prophets typically pronounced oracles in the name of the Lord. Such prophetic speech is rare in apocalypses, which present their revelations in visual form. Of course, the prophets also had visions, and there are clear lines of continuity between prophecy and apocalypses in this regard. But the apocalyptic visions are more elaborate, or as Susan Neidich has dubbed them, baroque. They are always mediated to the human visionary by an angel or other heavenly figure who explains the mysterious symbols of the vision or takes the visionary on a tour of places beyond the range of normal human experience. The visionaries are typically pseudonymous, famous worthies such as Enoch, who are supposed to have lived centuries before these books were actually written, although the Apocalypse of John is an exception in this regard. But the novelty of the apocalypses is not just a matter of literary form. In this case, at least, the genre bespoke a worldview, which I shall call apocalypticism. By worldview, I mean a distinctive set of assumptions about the way the world works and the destiny of human beings within it. In the case of apocalypticism, the novel aspects of this worldview concern the way history was conceived, the role of superhuman agents, angels and demons in human affairs, and expectations relating to the end of history and a life beyond this one. Two subgenres may be distinguished in the corpus of ancient apocalypses that has come down to us. One focuses on the course of history, the other on the order of the heavens, or in some cases, the nether regions. Many of the better known apocalypses, such as Daniel and Revelation, are of the historical type. There is some overlap between the two subgenres. In Revelation, for example, the visionary ascends to heaven, although he is not given a tour. The more elaborate historical apocalypses include a review of the whole course of history or of a large portion of it, in the guise of prophecy by an ancient figure. In the book of Daniel chapter 2, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar sees a statue composed of 4 metals: the head of fine gold, the chest and arms of silver, the middle and thighs of bronze, and the legs part iron and partly clay. Daniel interprets these so that the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar, the other metals represent the other kingdoms inferior to him. In the context of the book of Daniel, it is clear that these are the kingdoms of the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. The division of the Greek kingdom admits of various explanations. Alexander's kingdom was divided among his successors, and two of the resulting dynasties intermarried. In the end, the whole statue is destroyed by a stone that becomes a mountain. This represents the kingdom of God. For a Jewish reader, the mountain is clearly Mount Zion, although this point is not elaborated for Nebuchadnezzar. Other overviews of history from the Babylonian era forward are found in Daniel chapter 7, again in the form of 4 kingdoms, Daniel 9, where Jeremiah's prophecy that Jerusalem would be desolate for 70 years is reinterpreted as 70 weeks of years, or 490 years. Other apocalyptic visions offer even more elaborate overviews of history. Enoch, who supposedly lived before the flood, sees the whole history of humanity inscribed on heavenly tablets and divided into weeks. The Apocalypse of Weeks in 1 Enoch 93 and 91. Another section of 1 Enoch, known as the Animal Apocalypse, describes a vision of Enoch in which all biblical history, beginning with Adam, is told allegorically with the characters depicted as animals. Paul Cosman, a classic scholar who teaches at Harvard, has recently suggested that the long view of history in the apocalyptic literature was a reaction to the ideology of the Seleucid kings. Traditionally, in the ancient Near East, dates were calculated by reference to the reigns of individual kings. The Seleucids, however, introduced the dynastic era by dating everything from Seleucus I. The Seleucid system of dating was certainly remarkable in the context of the ancient Near East and was a striking affirmation of imperial power. It set the scene for other later totalizing claims of historical significance. Whether it can be used to explain the apocalyptic idea of total history seems to me doubtful. There were at least some earlier precedents, most notably Hesiod's works and Days, which encompassed all of history in a grand scheme of ages symbolized by metals. The apocalyptic view of history is also attested in Persia. The relevance of the Persian material is perennially disputed. The main Persian sources, such as the Bundahishn and the Zandivoman Yasin or Baman Yasht, date from the early Middle Ages. They very probably preserve much older material, but the dating of the material is difficult. Even in the biblical tradition, however, you find grand sweeps of history, even if it is not organized as neatly as it is in the Apocalypses. I would argue that the attempt to comprehend the totality of history was not only or primarily an act of political resistance, although it was sometimes used for that purpose. It was primarily an intellectual exercise. It occurs more frequently in the Hellenistic period than at any earlier time, and one may suspect that it was related to the increasing unification of the world from Greece to India that followed the conquest of Alexander. These overviews of history are significant in several respects. Since the course of history was already known before the flood, or in the case of Enoch, or in the Babylonian exile in the case of Daniel, it would seem to be fixed in advance. In most of the Hebrew Bible, the course of events is determined by human actions. This is the logic of the covenant in Deuteronomy. If Israel kept the covenant laws, it would prosper. If not, it would be punished. In the Apocalypses, however, the course of events cannot be altered. Daniel 9 contains a prayer by Daniel in which he confesses Israel's sin and implores God to have mercy and restore them. The revelation he receives at the end of the prayer, however, explains that the duration of Israel's punishment and its eventual restoration are already decreed. 70 weeks of years, or 490 years, must pass before the deliverance. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity. History has its own momentum and is not subject to random interventions, even on the part of the deity. While the course of history may be determined, this does not mean that the destiny of individual human beings is determined. On the contrary, the inevitability of certain events sharpens the decisions an individual must make. Typically, the extended reviews of history are presented as prophecies uttered long ago. Most of the duration of history is already past by the time the reviews are actually written. The actual time of the author can be recognized because at some point the predicted history no longer corresponds with the recorded events. So, for example, the book of Daniel, chapter 11, provides an accurate prediction of history for most of the Hellenistic age, down to and including the suppression of the Jewish cult by Antiochus Epiphanes in the Maccabean era. It goes on, however, to predict that the king would die between the sea and the holy mountain, that is, in the land of Israel. This did not happen. The king died in Persia after a failed raid on the temple of Artemis in Elymais in December 164 BCE. On the basis of this observation, the pagan philosopher Porphyry was able to infer that the predictions had not been composed in the Babylonian era, but rather shortly before the death of Antiochus. We can appreciate, however, the purpose of this fiction. The fact that so much of history had ostensibly been predicted accurately inspired confidence in the actual prediction of the death of the king and the vindication of the righteous. The apocalyptic vision could thus encourage the persecuted Jews to endure in the conviction that the remaining time was short. The vision of Daniel, however, was not only concerned with the events of the Maccabean era. It professed to disclose the meaning of history from the creation to the final judgment. One of the most effective ways of unifying history was by taking ancient myths that were originally designed to describe the creation of the world and projecting them into the eschatological future. In Daniel chapter 7, the visionary sees 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea and 4 great beasts coming up out of it. These are eventually explained as 4 kings or kingdoms. In the context of Daniel, they correspond to the 4 kingdoms of Nebuchadnezzar's statue in Daniel chapter 2, Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. The 4th beast is the most terrible. The vision of the beast is followed by a heavenly vision of an ancient figure seated on a throne, surrounded by thousands of attendants. He is approached by another figure riding on the clouds. Then there is a judgment, and the 4th beast is consigned to the fire, while the figure on the clouds receives an everlasting kingdom. Similarly, in the book of Revelation, John of Patmos sees a beast rising from the sea and another rising from the earth. Eventually, the beasts are thrown alive into the lake of fire in Revelation 19:20. Similar visions directly influenced by Daniel can be found in the Apocalypse of 4th Ezra at the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. At the end of the 19th century, a great German biblical scholar named Hermann Gunkel perceived the affinity between these apocalyptic visions and older Near Eastern myths that had recently come to light. The main exemplar of this kind of myth, often called the combat myth, that was available to Gunkel was the Babylonian creation myth Enuma Elish. That myth described a dramatic battle between the young hero god Marduk and Tiamat, who was at once the mother goddess and source of life, and a monster threatening to devour her offspring. Marduk prevails in the battle and constructs the universe from Tiamat's carcass. Gunkel recognized that the name Tiamat was cognate to the Hebrew Tehom, the word for the primeval deep waters in the opening chapters of Genesis. He also recognized the affinity between Tiamat and the stormy sea from which the beasts emerge in the book of Daniel. This led him to perceive a fundamental axiom of apocalyptic thought: Urzeit gleicht Endzeit. The primeval time of beginning is like the eschatological end time. Closer parallels to the biblical apocalypses came to light a few years before Gunkel's death at Ugarit in northern Syria. He opens his mouth, one lip to earth, one lip to heaven, and Baal goes down into him like an olive cake. Then the rains fall, wadis dry up, and everything withers. Fortunately for Baal, he has a formidable sister named Anat, who rescues him from the maw of death and restores his vitality by copulating with him. Then the rains return, the wadis run, and fertility is restored. The Canaanite myths are especially helpful for understanding the symbolism of Daniel and later of Revelation. One of the puzzles of Daniel's vision is the juxtaposition of two divine figures, one an ancient of days and the other one like a human being riding on the clouds. Jewish tradition was monotheistic, at least from early times. I would figure from perhaps about 1000 onward. Yet the imagery of riding on the clouds is most often associated with Yahweh, the God of Israel, and here there is another God above him. The imagery makes perfect sense in the Canaanite tradition, where El is the supreme deity, but Baal is the dynamic ruler who brings fertility. In the Jewish context, the rider on the clouds is reinterpreted as Michael, the patron angel of Israel. The Baal myth was well known in Israel, and to a greater degree it was adapted in the Israelite cult, so that Yahweh, rather than Baal, was the hero. Already in later prophetic books, the battle with the chaos monster is projected into the future. Isaiah chapters 24 to 27, a late insertion in the book of Isaiah, was written at some time after the Babylonian exile, at a low point in Israelite or Judean history. Like many of the prophecies of this period, it seeks consolation in the future. So we're told the Lord at some undetermined time will make a feast on Mount Zion, and he will swallow up death forever, in effect doing to death or Mot what Mot did to Baal in the Canaanite myth. By swallowing death, the Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth. In effect, he will set everything right that is wrong with this world. On that day, the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. This imagery is continued in Daniel and Revelation. In the beginning, the Creator God brought order to the world by defeating a monster that signified chaos, everything that threatens human life and flourishing. In the course of history, it often seems as if chaos has gained the upper hand. The apocalyptic vision affirms that in the end, the good God will prevail. In Revelation chapter 21, the visionary sees that the sea was no more, and hears a voice proclaim that death will be no more, eliminating the enemies of Baal in the old Canaanite myths. The evocation of the old combat creation myths unifies and simplifies history by suggesting that it is essentially reducible to a conflict of opposing principles. The negative chaos principle can be specified in many ways. It may refer to the untamed forces of nature, or to moral evil, or just to political opposition. But the myth asserts that life is an arena of conflict and that the good will prevail. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the conflict is between forces of light and darkness, in terms drawn from Zoroastrian dualism. There is a more balanced conflict than we usually find in the apocalypses, but dualism of some sort is intrinsic to the apocalyptic worldview. This is not a worldview that encourages moderation. Rather, in the words of Revelation, I wish you were either hot or cold. So because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. Dualism encourages intransigence and extremism. One can understand the attraction of dualistic worldviews, but they are often problematic. Besides the implicit dualism, the evocation of ancient myths expresses a sense that human affairs are beyond human control. Daniel's visions deal with political struggles of the Hellenistic age, especially the conflicts between Seleucids and Jews in the Maccabean period. But this is only the surface appearance. The angel Gabriel explains to Daniel that the real conflict is between angelic princes, the prince or patron angel of Greece, and the archangel Michael, the prince of Israel. The conflict is resolved not by the arms of the Maccabees, but by Michael, who arises in victory in Daniel 12, verse 1. Similarly, the kings of the various kingdoms are beasts that rise from the sea, embodiments of primordial chaos. On the one hand, this suggests a sense of powerlessness. The course of events is beyond human control. On the other, it actually suggests a sense of security, because the victory is assured. You know how the story will end. The sense that life on earth is subject to higher powers is also reflected in the increased prominence of angels and demons in apocalyptic texts. The idea of a heavenly council, where the supreme God was surrounded and supported by other divine beings, was prevalent in the ancient Near East and is often attested in the Hebrew Bible. The heavenly world was understood by analogy with the earthly. Divine councils in heaven reflected royal councils on earth. This is as true of the early apocalyptic literature as it had been for the older myths. The role of these heavenly beings in apocalyptic literature differs from the old divine council in the degree of their activity in human affairs. It is in the apocalyptic literature that angels are first given names. Michael and Gabriel in Daniel, several others in the Enoch literature: Raphael, Reuel, Sariel, Remiel, Uriel. The Watchers or fallen angels are also given names in 1st Enoch, most notably their leaders Asael and Shemihaza. In earlier times, God fought directly on behalf of Israel. In Daniel, this role is delegated to Michael. This phenomenon is part of what James Kugel has called the great shift in the way God is encountered in biblical times. In the early books of the Bible, God converses in familiar ways with Adam, Abraham, and Moses. In the later post-exilic books, divine communication is mediated through human-sized angels who could communicate with prophets and sages by addressing them face to face. This phenomenon first appears in late prophecy in the books of Zechariah and the later part of Ezekiel. In Daniel and Enoch, it is standard. It undoubtedly reflects the changing political circumstances of the Persian and Hellenistic ages, where rulers were increasingly distant and administration was increasingly delegated to an imperial bureaucracy. But if heavenly beings under God were assigned a greater role in human affairs in apocalyptic literature than they had enjoyed in earlier times, human beings were also granted an unprecedented level of access to the heavenly regions. There were, of course, precedents. Gilgamesh had journeyed to the world beyond. Enoch and Elijah had been taken up to heaven. In the development of Jewish apocalypticism, the figure of Enoch was pivotal. He had walked with Elohim. He had been taken up to heaven at the end of his life. In the writings attributed to Enoch in the Hellenistic period, Elohim was understood as angels rather than God. His works were with the Watchers, and with the Holy Ones were his days. The Book of the Watchers in 1st Enoch, chapters 1 to 36, describes Enoch's transportation to heaven and a tour of places beyond the normal range of human experience. These include the foundations of the earth, the prison of the fallen angels, the chambers where the dead are kept for judgment, the place prepared for the final judgment, and paradise. In later apocalypses, this heavenly tour is stylized so that the visionary ascends through a set number of heavens, 3 in older works such as the Aramaic Levi Apocryphon, later 7 or even 10. All the heavenly tours in Jewish apocalypses are ascribed to legendary figures of the distant past, such as Enoch or Abraham. It is unclear whether they at all reflect a practice of mysticism in Second Temple Judaism. At the least, it is apparent that some Jewish authors imagined ascent through the heavens and did so in great detail. Whether there was any tradition of mystical practice or not, the idea that such ascents were possible evidently gained currency. But another aspect of the permeability of the heavens was even more important. This was the ascent of the soul or spirit of the righteous dead, and conversely, the idea that the souls or spirits of the wicked would be condemned to punishment in the hereafter. The Hebrew Bible offers little hope to mortals in the face of death. Like sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death will be their shepherd. Straight to the grave they descend, and their form shall waste away. Sheol shall be their home. That's Psalm 49. Occasional exceptions might be made. But for the common lot of humanity, there would be no inquiry about life in Sheol. The book of Daniel, the latest book of the Hebrew Bible, is the only one to hold out hope of a resurrection of the dead. At that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the land of dust shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever. This early formulation does not envision universal resurrection, only the very good and the very bad. The scope would be extended in later apocalypses. It does not suppose that the dead will return on earth. The location of resurrected life is specified only in the case of the wise, many of whom are said to lose their lives in the time of persecution. They will shine like the stars, which in apocalyptic idiom means they will be companions of the host of heaven. That point is clarified in the Epistle of Enoch, where the righteous are told, "You shall shine like the luminaries of heaven, you will shine and appear, the portals of heaven will be opened for you will be companions of the host of heaven." What is involved here is not the restoration of life on earth, but the transformation of human life to a higher level. Similarly, according to the community rule from Qumran, the destiny of the children of life is everlasting blessing and eternal joy in life without end, a crown of glory, a garment of majesty in unending light. These formulations assume that the resurrected dead will have some kind of body, but not a body of flesh and blood, although the idea of physical resurrection would eventually take hold in both Judaism and Christianity. One of the most detailed discussions of the resurrected body is provided by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And as for what you sow, you do not sow the body that is to be, but a bare seed, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. What is sown is a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. The apocalyptic hope for resurrection pertains to what has been called the discovery of transcendence in the so-called axial cultures of the second half of the last millennium before the turn of the era. The idea of an axial age is, to my mind, problematic But it is undeniable that profound cultural and intellectual shifts took place in the Eastern Mediterranean world and the Middle East, and that these entailed a sharp distinction between this world and the transcendent realm of truth and normativity. I'm inclined to attribute these shifts to cultural factors in the Hellenistic age rather than to evolutionary biology. The idea of an immortal soul had been developed in Greece around the middle of the first millennium by the Pythagoreans and Orphics, and spread especially by Plato. The conception of the immortal spirit or soul in Jewish apocalypticism is unlikely to be derived directly from Platonic philosophy, but it represents a kindred development in a neighboring culture in the great melting pot of cultures in the Hellenistic age. It was through the rise of Christianity, however, that the apocalyptic worldview would have its greatest impact. Paul promised the Corinthians, "You will not die, we will not all die, but we will all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed." The belief that the end of history and the resurrection of the dead were at hand is what enabled the belief that Christ had been raised, the first fruits of those who have died. The main difference between Jewish and early Christian apocalypticism lay in the foreshortening of history in the New Testament. Rather than looking back to the time of Enoch and Daniel, the New Testament writers focus on the period inaugurated by Jesus. This intensifies the sense of imminent expectation. The book of Revelation is concerned with what must soon take place. This sense of imminent expectation is, of course, difficult to maintain over the long run, but it has recurred periodically throughout Christian history. The early Christian appropriation of apocalypticism is also colored by the paradigmatic importance assigned to the death and resurrection of Jesus. In Revelation, Jesus is the Lamb that was slaughtered and redeemed the saints by his blood. Satan is conquered by the blood of the Lamb and the testimony of the martyrs. Those who had died in time of persecution already had a prominent role in Daniel. Their role is intensified in Revelation. Revelation promises the transformation of this world in a new creation, but a central emphasis of the work is on the transcendence of death. Indeed, in the new creation, as in the so-called Apocalypse of Isaiah, death will be no more, for the first things have passed away. Even in Revelation, however, the emphasis on individual salvation is integrated in a comprehensive vision of the world, which is profoundly indebted to the ancient myths. Michael fights with the dragon in heaven. Beasts rise from sea and land, and there is a great climactic battle followed by a new creation. The vision of the world is one of a fragile place, constantly beset with crises that seem beyond human control. Anarchy is repeatedly loosed on the world. This vision acquires much of its power from the symbolism through which it is expressed. The fact that Revelation speaks of beasts and dragons, even if John of Patmos had specific reference in mind, meant that these symbols can be reapplied and the reference updated to interpret new crises throughout history. The appeal of apocalypticism arises from the fact that such crises are always with us. The surplus of meaning in the ancient texts is in no danger of being exhausted. Apocalypticism in one form or another is still very much with us in the modern world. In the English-speaking world, it was given a distinctive cast by the dispensationalist movement led by John Nelson Darby in the 19th century. This way of reading the apocalyptic tradition is narrowly focused in identifying modern reference for the symbols and using them to predict political events in the modern world. The classic apocalyptic work of this kind is Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, originally published in 1970, which became the best-selling non-fiction book of the decade and eventually sold more than 28 million copies, and identified signs of the end times in the founding of the State of Israel and the development of the European Union. A similar worldview was more recently popularized by the Left Behind series, authored by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. These books have promoted a conservative social agenda and unquestioning support for the State of Israel. Despite their popularity, they have been singularly lacking in literary merit and have led to the widespread assumption that apocalypticism entails a doctrinaire, fundamentalistic view of the world. The fact that Islamic extremism is also fueled by beliefs about imminent divine intervention and a dualistic view of the world have added to the disrepute of apocalypticism, at least in academic circles and among people who are politically progressive. In its modern form, apocalypticism often seems to promote extremism and intolerance. Can the same charges be legitimately brought against the classic apocalyptic worldview? Lorenzo di Tommaso, one of the leading authorities on Jewish and Christian apocalypticism at the present time, thinks they can. Amos Wilder, long-term professor of New Testament at Harvard and brother of the playwright Thornton Wilder, argued that the ancient texts, in contrast to their modern appropriations, testify to genuine transcendental apocalyptic. Di Tommaso denies that there was any such thing. He argues that apocalypticism is an unhealthy worldview, particularly in its biblical form. It is inimical to a mature vision of human destiny, he says, or any social order founded on humanistic ideals. The negative judgment extends to the apocalyptic simplification of history. Di Tommaso sees it as a totalizing worldview akin to Marxism, unable to accept historical causality based on the interaction of circumstance, happenstance, and human decision. It relies on the revelation of unimpeachable knowledge imparted by a transcendent reality. As such, he says, it is incompatible with a pluralistic approach to reality and the compromises that pluralism requires. Apocalypticism is surely not a worldview for all seasons. As Wilder already noted, classical apocalypticism presupposes a situation characterized by anomie, a loss of world or erosion of structures, psychic and cultural. It works best when the world is truly out of joint and not amenable to reasoned dialogue. Even in such situations, it is likely to exacerbate rather than to ameliorate conflict. Even though apocalyptic texts seldom exhort their readers to violence explicitly, they're often complicit in violence because of their polarized and uncompromising view of the world. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the classical apocalypticism of ancient Judaism and Christianity is far more nuanced than its latter-day dispensationalist progeny. The writings of Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye are virtually devoid of symbolism. The mythic images of Daniel and Revelation, in contrast, are inherently multivalent and can never be adequately decoded into prosaic language. They are essentially poetic visions of a world in disarray. In this sense, the poems of William Butler Yeats or T.S. Eliot are more faithful to the classic apocalypses than the Left Behind series. When Wilder contrasted ancient and modern apocalypticism, however, it was not the dispensationalist that he had in mind, but the secular appropriation of apocalypticism in some strands of modern literature. It was well represented in Eliot's poem The Wasteland, and even more vividly long after Wilder wrote in the writings of Cormac McCarthy, such as The Road, which describes a scene after a nuclear disaster, which are sometimes described as post-apocalyptic. What Wilder missed in this kind of literature is the phase of miraculous renovation and that world affirmation which has gone through the experience of world negation. A catastrophic imagination alone is not genuinely apocalyptic. McCarthy, to be sure, provides a glimmer of hope in a single flower that blossoms in his post-apocalyptic landscape. Classical apocalypticism was more robust in its hope. To be sure, the hope of salvation in another world, whether conceived as a new creation in the future or as a heavenly world of eternal life, is not without its problems, as it lends itself to displacement of human endeavour. But at least we should give it credit for its indomitable hope, which is not always supported by rational analysis of human affairs, but may well be indispensable to human flourishing. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions. I suggest that we start asking questions from the youngest participants of our conference.
And say who you are.
Well, hi, my name is Paulina.
Hi.
I study with Michael right now. I have I think my question is a little bit silly and inexperienced because I'm only on my second year of study. We haven't read a lot of apocalyptic literature yet. But in the part cosmogonic myth, you compare the pre-medieval time or beginning with this eschatological end time. You have this part where you compare this to the beginning of time and the end of time. You compare them and say that they are some kind of similar in a way, and in this way we can say that this is some kind of a circle or a cycle, probably. Do we have any kind of text where this full cycle restarts again, or is there some kind of a remark that this circle or cycle maybe perhaps again?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I don't, to my knowledge, you do not find it starting again in Jewish or Christian texts. You do in Persian apocalypses. And, there's some reason to think that Hesiod's works and days presupposed that the whole thing would start all over again. See, I think in in Daniel chapter 2, where you start with the head of gold and you go down, I think, the underlying assumption is that the kingdom at the end will be a return to a golden age.
Okay, yeah.
But now, I think in Daniel that cycle only happens once. But in some of the other apocalyptic forms, like the Persian, it could go through several cycles.
Thank you.
So if things don't work out so well in this one, hang in there.
Any other questions?
Hello, my name is Alexandra and I study with Paulina. And you mentioned that the question is doubtful, I think, but how exactly, from your point of view, are Persian and Jewish eschatological narratives connected?
Okay, the question is, how are Persian and Jewish apocalyptic narratives connected? It's a very controversial question. I personally think that there was Persian influence on the Jewish apocalypses, and that the Persian apocalypticism developed first. It's a difficult argument to make, because the main Persian sources that we have are very late. It is as if the only biblical texts we had were the medieval Hebrew manuscripts. Now, a lot of people say then you can't use these Persian texts for anything before the Middle Ages. But before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't have any biblical texts in Hebrew that were older than 8 or 900 AD. And nobody would have said that you can't use the biblical material for any older period. We have some accounts of the Persian dualism in Greek sources, most notably in Plutarch, who says he got it from Theopompus, and Theopompus lived about 300 BC. Now, I think there's very direct influence in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the case of something like Enoch, I think it's not so direct, but I think the Persians had this idea of all of history being divided up into periods and a resurrection at the end of it. And I think they had that before the Jews had it. And after all, the Jews then were governed by the Persians for a couple of 100 years. So we can't document it very well, but I think it's there. I think it's quite fundamental.
Okay, thank you. And I've noticed something like that seems to me some kind of quotation, because in the 21st chapter of Revelation it said that the sea was no more, as you mentioned.
Yes.
And in Judaism there is a phrase that there will be no mountains. And does it seem to you like a quotation, or is it just an extension of the same plot?
Well, I think the idea that the sea, there will be no more sea, that's more an echo of the old Canaanite myth, where the sea was the opponent of Baal, and saying there will be no more sea. It's a bit like saying there will be no more death. Now, I think what you have in the Bundahishn is kind of parallel to that. It's a very similar idea, but with a different motif. That it's a mountain rather than the sea. But good observation. Good.
Yeah. Any other questions? Maybe not only from the
Moving up
younger
in
generation,
age
but from-
here, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your insightful lecture. We are privileged here. I have two small questions. One concerning Lorenzo di Tommaso. I have no written text. Have I rightly understood that he considers the apocalyptic worldview as an unhealthy one?
That's what he said.
Could you elaborate a little?
Yeah.
In what sense? I mean, unhealthy in its genuine historical context, not nowadays as it exists, but in the ancient times. Yes? It is
Well,
so?
I think, he is concerned probably, first of all, with nowadays. Mm-hmm. Would it be good to think like that? And he says, no, it wouldn't. Fair point, perhaps. And then he says, well, would it have been any better in the period of the New Testament to think that the world is divided between good and evil? And this kind of rhetoric tends to come back in history, and usually it leads to antagonism. That's his point. Now, I think I am more sympathetic with the apocalyptic literature myself, but this may be because I've spent my life studying it. So, but I think, there is more poetry in it than he allows for. But I don't entirely disagree with him. I would say there are times when you may need a book like the Book of Revelation, but it's not your daily bread and butter. I mean, it's not a good way, probably, to think of life on a daily basis. Yes. Lorenzo, by the way, that was in an essay that he published in a book that was a Festschrift for me. So, but he is working on a big book. Whether he'll ever finish it, who knows? On the architecture of apocalypse.
The other question is, how do you date the earliest layers of the Enoch tradition? As far as I know, some Italian scholars, Paolo Sacchi, for instance, dates them as some portions of the Book of the Watchers, the astronomical book, as early as 400 years before the Christian era. What's your opinion?
I think some of that material might go back to the 3rd century. All the texts, the earliest texts that we have are no earlier than the 2nd century. Now, there were traditions behind those, and who knows how far back they go. I think the whole Enoch tradition probably started out in the Babylonian exile and developed, without being much in contact with the rest of Judaism until the Maccabean times. So, I think the traditions may be quite old, but it's very hard to pin them down. And the actual books that we don't have anything that would require us to go back, I think, even before 200.
Okay.
Something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions, remarks, ideas, insights? I have a question that often occurs to my mind when we deal with the peculiar developments of the second type of Judaism, or whatever we can call it. Because when we speak that something developed in the Persian era or in the Hellenistic era, we compare these phenomena with what we know from the canonical books of the Hebrew Bible that are presumed to be written before this, and we see this is absent from Pentateuch or from the corpus of the prophets, so it should be a new development. But in fact, we know that the canonical books of the Bible have been heavily edited by the Deuteronomistic movement and other movements, so that it may well be that a lot of things that are absent from these books are absent not because they were not familiar for the first temple Judaism, let's call it this way, but just because they were censored out by the Deuteronomists and so on. I remember someone has said this good motto: we have all been brainwashed by the Deuteronomists. As concerns, for example, the main motives of Apocalypticism, do you think there may be that some of these motives are not novelty emerging Persian and Greek period, but in fact go back to what was there even before the destruction of the first temple, from even in the Iron Age, but just we know nothing about this from the canonical books?
Well, I think, you see, in order to say that something goes back, you need to have some evidence for it.
Yes.
So, I mean, all things are possible, but until some evidence turns up, you can't really say much about it. Now, occasionally evidence does turn up. For example, what was it now, 50 years ago, inscriptions were found that mentioned Yahweh and his Asherah. So, evidently there was some goddess worship going on. This had been swept out by the Deuteronomists. Now, a very interesting one is the figure of the one like a son of man in the book of Daniel, where you have two divine figures. Now, you also get this in the very earliest material in the Hebrew Bible, where El is the high God and Yahweh is a member of the divine council. But now you don't get that anywhere else in the biblical material. Daniel Boyarin, who teaches at Berkeley, has argued that this would have been a strand of Judaism all the way down. And so that Christianity wasn't really breaking from Judaism in having a second divine figure. But I don't think many people would agree with that. It was all the way down. But at the same time, I think there must have been a tradition there that survived. I think a lot of this Canaanite material must have survived in the shadows and only becomes clear again in the later material. On the other hand, I think take something like the resurrection of the dead. I would want to see some evidence for it, deposited at any earlier time. And the earliest glimmers of that you get in Persian period texts. So Ezekiel 37, where it's clearly metaphorical, or Isaiah 26, where I think it's metaphorical too, where it's talking about the resurrection of the people. But it's only in the Persian period that they begin to talk about resurrection at all. So until somebody comes up with evidence to the contrary, I would say that's a late development.
I rather meant motives like the motive of cosmic battle, cosmic combat.
Oh, cosmic combat, that's Uralt.
Yes, but
Yeah.
It's not, does not belong to major topics of the Hebrew Bible as we know it, except for the late books.
But you get a lot of it. You get it in the Psalms and in the prophets.
Still,
Arise, arise, arm of the Lord. Was it not you that slew the dragon? And so forth.
Still probably
Yes,
it's
in
more
the book of Job, you get a lot of it. Yes.
Probably it's more the ancient Near Eastern context, like Ugaritic texts and so on,
Yeah.
that would allow us
to understand what was being said. That's true. That's true. But
it's
still-
a major topic that's still represented in most books.
But you see, once the Ugaritic text came to light, then you could see the motifs. But they were there.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Another one.
We still have about 5 minutes for questions.
And I just saw somebody put her hand up, and I'm not sure if she was just fixing her hair or if she was going to ask a question.
Okay, then. Thank you, John, for the lecture.